The courtroom was alive with tension, a charged silence broken only by the clicking of cameras and the soft shuffle of papers. Every seat was filled, every eye fixed on the man who once commanded the White House, now reduced to waiting on the judgment of another. Whispers rippled like distant thunder through the gallery, a reminder that the entire nation was watching, breath held, waiting for a storm they could sense but not yet see. Then it happened. Without warning, Donald Trump surged forward, his face flushed crimson, his voice cracking like a whip across the hushed chamber. He erupted at the judge with words so sharp, so venomous, that even the seasoned court reporters froze mid-sentence. His hands carved through the air, his fury spilling into every corner of the room. For a moment time seemed to stall. The guards shifted uneasily. The judge remained still. And the people who had come expecting a performance witnessed something else entirely. A collapse of restraint. A revelation of raw, unfiltered rage. Reporters scrambled, pens scratching, cameras flashing in a frenzy to capture the instant when the former president lost his composure. Gasps echoed as the phrase thundered from his lips, a line that carried not only defiance, but desperation. It was more than a tantrum. It was the sound of a man cornered, lashing out against the walls of truth closing in on him. And as the echoes faded, a single thought swept through the crowd. Unspoken but undeniable, something had been revealed that struck deeper than politics. Something hidden, dangerous, undeniable. In that moment the mask of power shattered, and the world saw something raw, unfiltered and dangerous. But what had driven him to such fury? What secret evidence had surfaced that left the room trembling? The answer was only beginning to unfold. This was not just another hearing tucked away in the endless labyrinth of American legal battles. This was the day the stakes rose higher than anyone could have anticipated. The day a courtroom transformed into a crucible, where the future of American politics was being tested in real time. On the surface, it looked like a routine proceeding, suits pressed, gavels ready, protocol in motion. But beneath that veneer, an invisible pressure pressed down on every soul present. They all knew this was the kind of moment history does not forget, because hidden inside the stacks of evidence was something Trump had not counted on, something that his team had fought desperately to suppress. It was not speculation, not rumor, but hard, undeniable truth. A secret piece of evidence, so damning that even those loyal to him exchanged nervous glances. It was the crack in the wall of bravado he had built for years, a fracture that no amount of shouting could seal. The tension inside that courtroom was not confined by walls. It bled outward through news alerts pinging on phones, through television networks preparing breaking banners, through the collective heartbeat of a nation that had grown, accustomed to chaos but still hungered for clarity. Americans of every background, immigrants who had carried the weight of sacrifice, working families who believed in fairness, young activists who demanded justice, leaned in closer. They could sense that the line between truth and manipulation, justice and corruption, was about to be drawn in sharper relief than ever before. For years, Trump had mastered the art of spectacle, turning every confrontation into a performance, every scandal into a rallying cry. But this was different. This was not a stage he could control. This was not a crowd he could charm. This was a judge who refused to bow, and evidence that refused to bend. And for once, the noise of politics fell silent, replaced by something weightier, the possibility that even the powerful could be cornered by truth. Every word spoken in that chamber carried consequences that would ripple far beyond those four walls. If the evidence stood, it would not just stain his legacy, it could fracture the narrative he had built around himself, the myth of invincibility that shielded him from accountability. For his supporters, it was unthinkable. For his critics, it was long overdue. For the nation, it was terrifyingly real. And yet, there was also something deeply human in the scene. The defiance of a man who had lived off spectacle colliding with the quiet resolve of a system designed to outlast any individual. It was justice against arrogance, calm against fury, order against chaos. A clash not just of personalities, but of principles that would decide whether America still believed in the power of truth. When the powerful were exposed, the audience in the courtroom leaned forward, eyes wide, hearts pounding. Across the country, millions were glued to their screens, waiting for the next word, the next headline, the next revelation. And as the judge's gavel struck with calm authority, signaling the entry of the evidence into record, there was no turning back. The game had shifted, and the stakes were no longer political, they were existential. Because what happened in that room would not end there. It would ignite conversations at kitchen tables, debates on cable news, outrage in the streets, and celebration in communities long dismissed. It would dominate hashtags, podcasts, op-eds, and living room arguments. It would, for better or worse, define the national mood. But what happened next was so explosive. It would dominate headlines across the world. Donald Trump's eruption in that courtroom did not come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of years, decades, of a man who had learned to wield arrogance as both shield and sword. Long before he ever stepped foot into the Oval Office, his reputation for bulldozing through rules, mocking opponents and dismissing authority was well known. In boardrooms, he cut off advisors mid-sentence. In depositions, he mocked the very lawyers questioning him. And in rallies, he turned belittling his enemies into a kind of sport, feeding off the roar of a crowd that mistook cruelty for strength. Courtrooms were no exception. Judges across the years had seen flashes of the same performance, interruptions, grandstanding condescension dripping from his every word. If the judge was a woman, the interruptions multiplied. If the evidence cornered him, the attacks became personal. To Trump, authority was not something to respect. It was something to conquer, humiliate, and bend to his will. Yet the irony was thick. This was the same man who campaigned as the champion of law and order, promising to restore dignity to institutions, claiming to be the one who could protect America from chaos. But behind the slogans lay a pattern that told a different story. The man who spoke of order thrived in disorder. The man who praised justice lived by manipulation. And the man who promised to defend institutions had spent his life undermining them whenever they refused to serve his personal ambition. For his supporters, the bravado was intoxicating, a rebellion against elites they resented. But for those who watched closely, the cracks were always there. The endless lawsuits, the evasions, the settlements whispered of someone who believed rules applied to everyone but him. He saw every judge not as a figure of law, but as an opponent in yet another reality show episode 1. He could dominate with insults, delay tactics, or sheer noise. That is what made the moment of his explosion so striking, because for years he had carried himself as untouchable, a man who could glide through scandal after scandal by shifting blame and doubling down on arrogance. His formula was simple: never admit, never retreat, never yield. And in politics, it had carried him farther than many thought possible. But courtrooms are different. They are not arenas for applause lines, nor theaters for reality television. They are governed by a rhythm older than any campaign, older than any man's ego. And in that rhythm, Trump's tactics, mockery, defiance, interruption were not weapons. They were liabilities. So when he shouted across the bench, when his fury spilled into the chamber, it was not just another outburst. It was the inevitable breaking point of a long history of entitlement, colliding with an institution that refused to bend. It was poetic justice unfolding in real time. The man who had spent years branding himself as the enforcer of law was now raging against the very guardians of it. In the gallery, people could feel the contradiction searing through the air. The irony was almost too perfect. The same voice that once promised order was now the loudest source of chaos. The same man who had demanded loyalty from judges was now lashing out at one who stood firm. And in that contradiction, in that unraveling, lay a truth the audience could not miss. This meltdown was not an accident. It was a destiny written years before, a collapse scripted by arrogance itself. But if Trump's backstory was a tale of unchecked defiance, the judge facing him carried an entirely different story. One rooted not in spectacle, but in service. And it was that story which would soon collide with his, changing the courtroom forever. While Trump's outburst seized headlines, the quiet figure at the center of it all, the judge, carried a very different kind of power. There was no shouting, no grandstanding, no need for theatrics, just a calm presence honed by decades of service, a dignity that did not demand attention but commanded it all the same. For those who knew her history, the contrast could not have been sharper. Where Trump's life was built on spectacle, hers was built on substance. She had grown up believing that the law was not merely a profession, but a calling, a way to safeguard the vulnerable, to steady a society that often teetered on division. In her early years on the bench, she presided over cases that rarely made national news, local disputes, family conflicts, small claims, yet even then her approach stood out. She listened, she weighed, she resisted the easy pull of bias. In a world where arrogance often drowned out reason, her integrity was her armor. As her career advanced, so did the storms swirling around her. She navigated politically charged trials, cases that pitted community against community, moments when partisan lines threatened to eclipse justice itself. But through each storm she held steady. Her philosophy was simple yet profound. The law must serve truth, not power. That belief earned her respect, even from adversaries who disagreed with her rulings. And now, seated high above the chaos of Trump's eruption, that philosophy was being tested like never before. She did not flinch at his insults, nor react to the spectacle of his rage. To her, the courtroom was sacred ground. And in that space, dignity was not weakness, it was strength. Every measured pause, every calm rebuke carried more weight than 1,000 insults hurled in anger. For the audience watching, both in the gallery and across the country, the symbolism was unmistakable. Here was a woman embodying the quiet power of integrity, standing firm against the bluster of arrogance. She represented not just the authority of the court, but the resilience of justice itself, the idea that truth could withstand even the loudest storm. It was easy, in an age of social media outbursts and political theater, to forget that real strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is the stillness that commands the room, the composure that disarms chaos, the patience that outlasts fury. That was the power she carried, and it was on full display now, when the stakes could not have been higher. For years, she had endured long nights away from family, sacrifices unnoticed by cameras, the burden of decisions that could change lives in an instant. Every lesson, every struggle, every moment of restraint had prepared her for this clash. She knew what Trump did not, that the courtroom was not a stage, but a crucible, and in that crucible, truth had a way of burning away even the most carefully constructed masks. And in this moment, every lesson, every sacrifice would be tested. What she did next would not just decide the course of this trial. It would echo far beyond those walls, shaping how a nation understood dignity in the face of rage. But the clash was only beginning. The confrontation, the evidence, and the unraveling yet to come would push both figures to their limits and leave the world stunned at what unfolded next. The air inside the courtroom thickened with tension, every breath charged, every glance sharpened. It was no longer just a hearing. It had become a battlefield, and Trump was determined to seize it as his stage. He leaned forward, his voice booming across the chamber, cutting off attorneys mid-sentence. Each interruption was sharper than the last. Personal jabs aimed at the judge, mocking remarks flung at the prosecution, words chosen not for substance, but for spectacle. "You're biased! Everyone knows it," he thundered, his finger stabbing the air. "This whole thing is a disgrace, a witch hunt. You should be ashamed." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The cameras clicked furiously, capturing every contorted expression, every vein straining against his skin. For Trump, the courtroom was no longer a place of law but an arena, where his survival depended on dominating the narrative, no matter how chaotic. And yet against this storm, the judge remained unmoved. Her face was calm, her tone precise, each word measured as if carved from stone. She did not match his volume. She did not lower herself to his fury. Instead, she countered his chaos with order, her gavel striking like a drumbeat of authority. "Mr. Trump," she said firmly, her voice carrying through the noise, "this courtroom will not be a stage for your theatrics. You will respect the process. You will respect the truth." The contrast could not have been clearer. On one side, a man unraveling, relying on volume and insult. On the other, a figure of steady composure, holding the line with quiet authority. Each exchange drew the crowd closer to the edge of their seats, sensing the collision building. Trump smirked, sneered, and tried again, hurling accusations at the prosecution, questioning the legitimacy of the evidence, painting himself as the victim of a vast conspiracy. But with every outburst, the judge's responses grew sharper, firmer, more devastating in their restraint. She did not need insults. Her authority was her weapon, and it struck deeper than any shouted word. The gallery was silent now, the earlier gasps replaced by a tense anticipation. Reporters clutched their pens, ready to capture the moment that everyone felt approaching. Something was coming, something that would pierce through the noise and leave no room for denial. The balance teetered on a knife's edge. Trump's fury filled the room, but the judge's composure absorbed it like a stone against waves. The breaking point was near. The silence between exchanges grew heavier, the tension unbearable. And then it happened. The prosecutor stepped forward, a file in hand, eyes steady as they turned toward the bench. The judge nodded once, giving permission. The folder was placed on the stand, opened with deliberate care. Inside lay the evidence no one expected, the revelation that would tear through the courtroom like lightning. But then the evidence no one expected was unveiled, and everything changed. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. After hours of sparring, interruptions, and Trump's thunderous outbursts, the judge leaned forward with the kind of measured calm that only comes from decades of service. In the face of chaos, his gavel rested untouched, his expression unreadable, but his eyes carried the weight of something no one in the room was prepared for. "Mr. Trump," the judge began, his voice steady but heavy with significance, "it is time this court addresses evidence that until now has remained sealed." The words landed like a thunderclap. The crowd shifted uneasily. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised, as if about to catch lightning in their notebooks. Trump froze, momentarily caught off guard. For a man who thrived on spectacle, it was rare to see him robbed of control. Then it happened. A file, thick, sealed, and ominous, was placed on the bench. The judge gestured for it to be opened, and within seconds, the courtroom's oxygen seemed to vanish. The documents were not just legal records. They were a roadmap, a trail of actions and conversations that had been hidden from public view. The kind of evidence that didn't just poke holes in a defense, it detonated it. Trump's face reddened, his jaw tightening as he tried to preemptively discredit it. "This is fake. Another witch hunt. You can't do this," he barked, pounding the table. But the judge didn't flinch. Instead, he spoke with surgical precision. "These are authenticated records, corroborated by sworn testimony and verified beyond dispute." Trump's bravado began to crack. His voice, once booming, now wavered as he tried to shout over the tidal wave of truth. His hands gripped the edges of the table, his shoulders hunched, not with confidence, but with the weight of exposure pressing down on him. The judge, unwavering, read aloud excerpts from testimony that undercut Trump's claims, weaving a narrative of contradictions that could no longer be ignored. Every word was deliberate, every phrase sharpened like a blade. And then, the moment, the judge paused, glanced across the room, and delivered a single line that seemed to echo through history. Truth, Mr. Trump, is not intimidated by volume. It stands unmoved. While lies collapse under their own weight, the courtroom erupted, not with chaos but with stunned silence, as though the very walls were holding their breath. Trump, for once, had no retort. His face, once flushed with fury, now drained of color. The storm he had tried to unleash had been silenced with a sentence. In that instant, the roles reversed. The self-proclaimed master of dominance was reduced to sputtering disbelief, while the judge, calm, steady, and resolute, stood as the embodiment of justice itself. It was the cinematic mic drop moment. The hero's counterattack delivered not with fire, but with the unshakable power of truth. And the world was watching. The gavel struck, and with that final echo, the courtroom recessed. But while the walls of justice stood calm, the world outside convulsed. Within minutes, the meltdown had leapt beyond oak-paneled chambers into the bloodstream of the internet. A single clip, Trump's reddened face, his defiance crumbling into incoherent protest as the judge's calm voice cut through, spread like wildfire. It was replayed, remixed, slowed down, and set to dramatic music. Hashtags roared to life. Ja, justice prevails. Ja, Trump meltdown. The judge speaks. Twitter timelines became battlegrounds. Supporters of law and order cheered, their words drenched in vindication. For years, one user wrote, we were told power was untouchable. Today we saw it bleed. Others turned to humor, memes of Trump. Slamming his fists were paired with captions mocking his unraveling. The internet's version of poetic justice. Cable news anchors rushed to their desks, breathless as they cut live to panels of analysts. Some described it as a constitutional gut check. Others went further, calling it the moment history will circle in red ink. Even late-night comedians couldn't resist. Within hours, monologues were written, clips recorded, laughter weaponized. Celebrities chimed in, their millions of followers amplifying the storm. A-list actors posted side by side images of the judge's calm stare next to Trump's contorted rage. Athletes tweeted simple one-word reactions, justice. Musicians reshared the clip as if it were a new track drop. The soundtrack of accountability. But beyond the humor and headlines, there was a deeper tremor. For millions who had long felt powerless, who watched the rich and powerful dodge consequences, this moment was seismic. It wasn't just a court proceeding, it was a cultural earthquake. For the first time, one woman wrote in a viral thread, I felt like the scales weren't rigged against us. I felt seen. Commentators on progressive platforms framed it as a turning point. The arrogance of unchecked power, finally colliding with the patience of the law. The judge, a symbol of quiet dignity, had stood unshaken, embodying the idea that justice, though slow, always arrives. Meanwhile, Trump's defenders scrambled. Some dismissed the evidence as fake, others lashed out at the judge as biased. But the force of the moment was too large to contain. Every attempt to spin the narrative only amplified the original truth. The meltdown happened, and the world saw it. As night fell, the clip remained pinned at the top of every feed, looping endlessly. It was more than just a viral moment. It was a scar across Trump's legacy, and a reminder to every onlooker that power can scream, but justice whispers louder. And as millions watched from their phones, laptops, and TV screens, one thought resonated like a drumbeat. Something had shifted. The balance of power, long thought untouchable, had been challenged and cracked. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in the halls of justice. For all the shouting, the finger-pointing, and the theatrics that Donald Trump had brought into the courtroom. What endured was not his voice, but the judge's silence after his final words. That silence wasn't empty, it was full, charged, alive. It carried the weight of truth, the kind that doesn't need volume to command attention. As the dust settled, it became clear this clash had never been about one man's ego versus one judge's restraint. It was about something far greater. It was about what defines a nation at its breaking points. The judge, with decades of service, had not wielded his power like a weapon. Instead, he embodied something rarer: integrity. He proved that in an age where arrogance screams to be heard, dignity can whisper and still shake the earth. His steady voice reminded the world that strength is not in bluster, but in composure. That justice, when anchored in principle, can withstand even the fiercest storm. For Trump, rage had been his tool. For the judge, truth was his shield. And in the end, truth proved unshakable. This was no ordinary courtroom battle. It became a parable for an entire society. We live in times when arrogance often disguises itself as leadership, when noise drowns out reason, when those who shout the loudest claim the mantle of authority. Yet here was proof, vivid and undeniable, that history does not remember the tantrum. History remembers the principle. Millions watching from their phones, their TVs, their laptops felt a quiet surge of validation. For years, many had felt overwhelmed by the volume of deception, by the audacity of arrogance, by the endless cycle of chaos. But now, watching the judge dismantle rage with nothing more than dignity, they realized something profound. Power is not in the spectacle. Power is in truth. It was more than a courtroom victory. It was a cultural reckoning. Teachers told their students the next morning, "This is what justice looks like." Parents whispered to their children, "This is what courage sounds like." Commentators on both sides of the aisle, though some begrudgingly, had to admit that what they had witnessed was history in motion. And as the judge recessed for the day, his words lingered like a moral compass for the nation. Dignity is stronger than rage, truth stronger than bluster. This was not the end of Trump's battles, nor was it the final chapter of division in America. But it was a reminder that no matter how loud arrogance becomes, it will always eventually be tested. And when tested against truth, arrogance crumbles. Because in the end, it wasn't chaos or volume that etched itself into history's ledger. It was courage. It was dignity. It was truth. And that, more than any scandal or spectacle, is what defines a nation worth believing in. Trump's courtroom explosion grabbed the headlines, but that was never the true story. The real narrative, the one that will endure, was written in the judge's calm, unwavering presence. While fury and chaos raged around him, he stood firm, proving that integrity does not need volume to be heard, and that dignity can withstand even the most aggressive storm. This moment was a reminder to every American watching: no matter how loud arrogance becomes, truth and principle always leave the deepest mark. History favors those who act with courage, who serve justice over spectacle, and who choose patience and honesty over bluster and intimidation. If you believe in dignity over arrogance, share this story. Let it inspire conversations at your kitchen table, your workplace, and your online communities. Subscribe to be part of a movement that refuses to stay silent in the face of chaos, that champions truth when the world seems determined to ignore it. Because in the end, the lesson is clear. History is written not by the loudest voice, not by the most forceful tantrum, but by the strongest truth. And in that truth lies the power to shape a nation, to inspire a generation, and to remind us all that integrity is always victorious.